So thanks a lot for inviting us to present this work. So first of all, it's a joint work with Lukas, Gerard, and Stefano. So they are the expert on the setting. So any question should be addressed to them. And so we're going to talk about mitigating the consequence of job loss in lower income countries using evidence from Ethiopia. So this paper has two main motivations. The first one is about the loss of formal jobs in what we call lower income countries. You have to think about low and lower middle income. So what we all know is that formal kind of productive jobs are scarce in lower income countries. And then there is a growing literature on like barriers to formation of these productive matches. And Gerard, Stefano, and Lukas have been working, among others, very much on this. But one thing that we lack evidence of is what happens if workers actually lose these jobs. That's something that we highlight in a chapter in a handbook that was just published earlier this year. And so we argue in this paper that this evidence gap is partially acute for kind of manufacturing jobs. So think about urban, blue-collar, formal jobs that are currently being promoted by many governments in low-income countries as an attempt to basically induce a structural transformation. And so why is that? Why would that be more acute for that group? For two reasons. First is that basically there is a lot of worker-specific investment in this kind of job, in the sense that recruiting workers involves major investment because workers have to basically accept to often move to places where these jobs are. They have to accept a lot of change in lifestyle, etc. And you have to train them as well. And there is some evidence that maybe not everyone is going to love this kind of job, this kind of settings. And then these jobs are often in export-oriented industries, so they're going to be exposed to potential shocks from international demand, some of them temporary. And so then a key question that we ask here is, does job loss drive workers away persistently from these key industries and locations that we kind of invested in bringing them there to begin with? So that's the first motivation. The second motivation is about the type of policies that countries around the world have to try to help workers financially after job loss, what we call job displacement insurance. And so here's a graph from that chapter that I mentioned, so that I wrote with Gustavo Gonzaga and John Aritomi. So basically, there are two main policies that government use. One is you kind of standard unemployment insurance, so where workers receive payment, let's say, like regularly, like monthly or weekly, under the condition that they are not back into a new formal job. The other one is like severance pay, where essentially government mandate firms to pay a lump sum at job loss. And so this graph shows you the prevalence of these two types of policies across country by country income. And so what you can see, and here it's going to tell you the share of those countries that have one of these policies. And you can see that essentially severance pay is big everywhere. Unemployment insurance really disappear as you go down the country income group. And you can imagine why. You have to track where the workers are reemployed. It might be more challenging. But severance pay is basically the only thing that exists in low-income countries and the main program in low-income countries. And we have a big evidence gap on the effect of these policies in low-income settings, and also even in high-income setting on the effect of severance pay versus unemployment insurance. There's a lot more work on unemployment insurance, partly maybe because the US doesn't have a mandated severance pay. And so we are interested in trying to inform the design of these kind of policies in low-income countries. And so we're going to try to shed light on two questions. What could be the welfare gain from providing more support to formal workers at job loss? Should we extend the amount of support? And also, what are the welfare gain of providing support in that specific form that exists in low-income countries, which is this lump sum transfer at job loss? And why is that interesting, especially the second question? Because I've worked with Gerard Aritomi in the AR, where we showed that in Brazil, where there is severance pay, and with consumption spending for workers who were laid off and workers who were not, you can see there is a big spike in spending when workers receive the lump sum at layoff. So workers spend it very quickly and don't really use it to smooth consumption, which we think as the reason why we have this program to begin with. And we have some qualitative evidence in this paper, a very short survey, where we try to elicit demand for hypothetical a system that would pay support in tranches instead of in a lump sum. And a majority of people seems to express some desire for this because it could help them control expenditure. But it's all like very, very qualitative. But then in the paper, we show that, in a simple structural model, there is a potentially large gain from moving to payment that remain unconditional, like severance pay, but actually are mechanically helping workers to smooth consumption if they might have some temptation or prison bias issues, which is consistent with the fact that they have a demand for it. But no one does that. And so that's something we're going to test here is what happens if you try to implement something like that. And then second, there's basically no evidence on the impact of these kind of policies on reemployment outcome in low-income countries. And so we don't know whether this kind of support speeds up or slows down reemployment, especially in that kind of jobs that government really want to promote. We also don't know whether the form of payment matters for the reemployment effect. And I come from public economics in general. The Chetty 2008 is kind of the core paper. In that paper, they argue it shouldn't matter whether you pay lump sum or monthly for reemployment. Okay, so what do we do in practice? So we're going to do two things. We're going to do an RCT with workers who were displaced from a garment factory in Ethiopia with three treatment groups, a control group that just receive whatever is the law in Ethiopia, which is a severance pay about 2 to 3 wages. Then we have a lump sum group where we top that up with another one of payment. And then we have a monthly treatment where we provide an equivalent amount of support, but in 5 monthly tranches. And then, so that's going to be a typical RCT. And then we're going to exploit quasi-experimental variation to try to also quantify the effect of job loss per se. So for that, we're going to recruit a sample of workers from another garment factory who were not laid off at the time. We call them the non-displaced sample. And we're going to do a difference in difference, reweighting the non-displaced sample so it looks as closely as possible to the control group in the experimental arm. And then we're going to track workers' outcome for 1 year post-layoff at the relatively high frequency. So we have like 7 instruments, 1 baseline, 1 endline, and then 5 high-frequency phone survey. The baseline and line were in person to really track down outcome over time, something that is quite rare even in high-income countries. So very quickly on the setting, so it's in an industrial park in Hawassa. These parks are very important. This is one of the big parks in a relatively large city. The typical work in the park are young, female, with secondary education. Many are first-time migrants, so they have to adjust to living there. They probably never worked in this kind of factory setting. This is a key, historically, this is a key group for structural transformation. If you think about European countries, the US, China, Mexico, the factory girl is kind of the archetype of this development of the manufacturing industries. The key challenge, as I said, is really to attract these workers in these areas and to retain them there. So the government really care about that. And then basically the reason we could do this study is that there was a firm in the park that was a partner to my co-authors in an earlier project that basically had to lay off most of their workers in September 2022. The reason for that is that Ethiopia, because of the civil war, lost the duty-free access to the US market. And it turned out that this firm was heavily invested in exporting to the US, while other firms in the park were not. So this firm basically suffered a demand shock that was idiosyncratic to that firm. So quickly on so that's kind of the timeline. I just want to highlight that. So they were laid off at the end of August, early September. That's when they received the severance pay from the firm. We top it up in October just to make sure that they understand that these are separate things. And then we also pay the monthly payment over 5 months. And then we keep serving workers after that. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to first talk about the impact of job loss, then the impacts, the experimental arm, and then try to say something about welfare implications. So this is kind of the only time series graph I'm going to show you, but you can see we can basically try to recover the full trajectory of workers over more than 1 year. So we talk a lot about 14 months because month 0 is right after layoff, and the end line, the last month we collected information for in the end line is month 13 with respect to that. So this is the fraction of workers who are wage employed. In black, you have the displaced control, and then you have 2 versions of the gray line. The dashed line is the non-displaced, the whole group, and then the solid one is the the workers within a non-displaced sample that remain in the employed in the park persistently. So in the high income, middle income literature, these are two different types of counterfactual that people have used for this kind of event analysis. So what you can see upon job loss, a huge reduction in wage employment, people do catch up, but not fully. Even a year after the layoff, about 50% of people are back into wage employment. And so you can see that in our non-displaced sample, some people basically left wage employment as well, but still there is a big gap that remains. And so then most of the table I'm going to show you are going to of that form. So here I'm showing you the diff and diff effect, comparing the displaced control to the whole non-displaced sample. All of the effect will be bigger if you compare it to the always employed. And so I'm showing the mean over this 14-month period and also the last month, the long term essentially. And so you can see there is a big negative effect persistent on wage employment. There's a little bit of an increase in self-employment, but it's very minimal and not significant. So it does nothing to essentially mitigate the shock. And then in this setting, if the drop in wage work is essentially similar to the drop in formal work, in factory work. So these are the kind of wage work that people find. And also the former to last column, you can see that over the period, these workers do surge at some point. So we have a 50 percentage point increase in whether or not you surge at all over the period. So it looks like this is kind of involuntary, at least for a decent group of workers. This kind of the fact that they don't have wage employment. Then this is on expenditure and financial variables. So you can see that, not surprisingly, there's a big drop in labor income. Some of that is compensated by net transfers from kinship, net kinship transfer. But you still have a big gap in total expenditure. That also shows up if you look at core expenditure, something is closer to consumption. And in this setting, because the initial wage are relatively low, it translates into increase in extreme poverty, so a doubling of extreme poverty. So if you want to think about magnitude, the relative drop is not that different from the one people have estimated in upper middle income countries, but because we are so close to a low level, it actually translates into more severe outcomes in terms of poverty. And then what we find a big effect on migration, so on out migration, so 20 percentage point increase in the share of the sample that lives out of Awassa by now, and most of it is going back home, often in rural areas. And then, maybe there's a little bit of a jobless effect on marriage, not much on other kind of a dimension of people's life. So we have a mediation analysis trying to see how much of the wage employment effect in month 13 can be explained by migration and marriage, and that's only 34%. So it probably plays a role interacting that, but still among people who stayed in Awassa, you have a reduction in wage employment. So now the treatment effect. So here I'm going to show the short term. So this is in months 0-1 or in months 2 to 5 after job loss. So month 0-1 is when you receive the lump sum, months 2 to 5 is when you still receive the monthly if you're in a monthly group. So what you can see in the first column is that there's a spike in expenditure if you receive the lump sum, so in month 0-1. But then by months 2 to 5, the lump sum is already spending like the control, and now the monthly is spending more. Okay, so clearly the flow of cash influences the flow of expenditure. And then the other striking thing is the effect on wage work. So you can see that the lump sum is reducing wage work immediately, and by months 2 to 5, it's an 11 percentage point drop in wage work. You can see the baseline is like 42%, right? So it's a massive effect. And there's a little bit of compensation in self-employment, especially in the very short term, but that's going to die out pretty quickly. So there's a big negative effect on being economically active of receiving the lump sum, and you don't see anything like that for the monthly. So that's like conceptually a very striking. Like the pattern for total expenditure, that's comparable to the things that we would have predicted, maybe based on my study with Gerard and Tommy. The impact on wage work is completely unexpected. Even like we had some prediction surveys, and no one expected to see that. And then we delve more into this. So if you look at the short-term effect on expenditure, actually you can see that it's entirely driven by people who at baseline wanted the monthly payment. So we recovered willingness to pay to receive the monthly versus the lump sum, and people who receive either monthly or lump sum. And so we explain why, but basically the there's a 25% who really want the monthly. So this seems to reveal a demand for tranche payment, so they must be sophisticated about it. If you give them the lump sum, that's the first column, they spend more. But the other group, if you give them the lump sum, they don't spend that much more than a monthly. And then you see that in core expenditure. But then the other group is actually the one driving the wage employment effect. So the other group seems to be a group that kind of is happy to not be in this kind of wage employment. If you give them the lump sum, they actually end up there. So you can see in the last column on the top panel, the strictly preferred monthly, they're actually searching harder for jobs, which makes sense if they overspend. The other group is searching less. And then the effect on wage work, self-employment, migration, everything is coming from people who actually didn't want the monthly. They were happy with the lump sum. And so that's the long-term effect. And so in the long term, we still see that the monthly has a positive effect on total expenditure over the whole period and at end line, especially compared to the lump sum. And the wage work effect basically persists. So you give the money in a lump sum or in a monthly, and 13 months down the road, people are still working less if they receive lump sum transfers. And so the gain in the monthly for total expenditure is compensate the drop in absolute poverty by a third. And the effect on wage work, again, shows up in all the measure of wage employment that we have. Then if you look at trying to understand this long-run impact, we basically show that, again, this difference between this demand for monthly tranches actually mediates quite a bit of what happens. So, so basically, people who did not necessarily want this monthly payment are driving a lot of this difference. So they are the one who are trying self-employment. At end line, they are less likely to want to work in a factory job. They have less employed friends. They are much more likely to have moved home. And then, yeah, so that's on work and migration. And then in personal life, you see that they're also more likely to be married, more likely to have children, less likely to be in education. So there's really kind of a group of people, if you give them the lump sum, they essentially, to some extent, check out from wage employment and go back to a more kind of traditional lifestyle that maybe would be expected for this young woman in Ethiopia coming from rural areas. And basically with a mediation analysis, so if you include like the variation in early job search, whether you try self-employment, whether you are back home at end line, whether you're married and whether you have children, you can explain like more than 90% of the wage employment effect in the long run in the group that doesn't want the monthly payment, and very little in the other group. In the other group, it's really the typical story. If you overspend, you're willing to accept like lower quality job, and then you kind of, these jobs are more likely to basically end. Okay, so maybe I have like 2 minutes. And so we try to say something about welfare, then we use a standard public economics framework to do that. So first we try to see what would be the welfare effect of changing the modality of additional support from lump sum to monthly. So for that, we showed on average there's a small gain in private surplus because workers on average slightly prefer the monthly, but that's very small. It's only equivalent to a gain of 3% of the transfer value. Also, if you do monthly, it's going to basically reduce the negative effects of the support on the budget of the government because workers are more likely to come back to formal jobs. And also, if you care about whether or not workers are back in manufacturing employment, the monthly is going to do a bit better. It's not obvious how much government care about that, but if you give me what's the value of having some of these people who were trained and attracted to the park back in the park, I can compute that for you and add that to the. So we do some, we provide various numbers because we don't really know what that number is. But then we also see, okay, what would be the effect of going from lump sum to offering the choice of payment modality? And so here there's a bigger gain in private surplus because you don't force it on people, and a fair number of people don't want the monthly. So here actually just offering choice would be equivalent to increasing the value of the money you give to people by 11%. So it's not small. You would also do slightly better on the fiscal externality and kind of the industrial policy externality because some people will go back faster to formal employment or wage employment. And then finally, we look at the social efficiency again from additional support. At end line, we do an elicitation to see how much people are willing to pay for additional support if they were to lose their job again. And we find very big willingness to pay, much bigger than the cost of providing that kind of support in an actually fair way. And so as a result, it looks like basically extending extending job displacement insurance here. People would be willing to pay for it, and this gain in private surplus is so big that it would compensate externalities, whether it's on the budget of the government or on reducing manufacturing. And we also did a small follow-up in another sample for external validity in Addis, a more representative sample of workers, and this high demand for additional job displacement insurance shows up to the same degree, essentially, there. So that's basically where we are. Just briefly, so the conclusion, so we show positive impact of job loss in low-income countries. One question that is interesting to raise, maybe for future work, is that we have both high demand for formal insurance with sizable informal insurance in the background. So it looks like this informal insurance is not enough and might actually come with some utility cost, which is consistent with the literature. We show the impact of GDI policies in low-income countries, and it looks like the fact that it's provided lump sum in all of these countries may conflict actually with the objective of the government. And then the implication for the design of these policies, it looks like at least allowing for payment in tranches, which is kind of easy to do in these settings because all of these workers are formal, they have a bank, they pay through bank account, etc. Could be welfare improving and even maybe mandated monthly payment. So leaving you on this. Thanks a lot.
I'm the discussant of this paper, which I really enjoyed reading and also now listening to the presentation. So let me quickly give you kind of the highlights. So what the paper does is it studies the consequences of job loss in a low-income setting. And it evaluates both the level and the structure of job loss insurance. So the paper finds that job loss causes persistent declines. 32% are drop in employment after 14 months, consumption declines, and large increases in poverty. It also finds these very interesting differences between two modalities of giving job loss insurance, namely lump sum transfers versus kind of monthly tranche payments. And here, these lump sum transfers is basically emulating what the government in Ethiopia does, but just giving higher payment than what people would normally do. And monthly tranche payments, I guess, it's not really emulating anything because, yes, our unemployment insurance is monthly, but it's also conditional on not being employed, which it's not in this case. So in this case, you get the payments regardless here. And they find these very interesting divergence in outcomes depending on the modality of payments. And the lump sum transfers, perhaps not entirely surprising, short-term spending increases. Whereas when you have these monthly payments, it's much more smooth. But the really surprising thing is this divergence in the employment outcomes, namely, for the lump sum transfers, it's a negative outcome, whereas the tranche payments, you don't find that. So the main contribution of the paper really is that it provides this incredibly detailed evidence and very credible evidence on the effects of job loss and job loss insurance in a low-income setting. And we actually haven't studied that very much yet. Of course, for high-income countries, there's an incredible amount of work on this. But in low-income countries, also these kind of formal wage jobs are a much more recent phenomenon. And so understanding this is really important. So in terms of the empirical design, it's a natural experiment. There was this tariff shock, mass layoff, and then the paper does two things. One is actually just a diff and diff design, which compares displaced workers to not displaced workers, and it does that very credibly. And the other is this RCT. And I should say what stands out in the paper is really this incredibly rich data, high frequency data, and what's also a really great thing in terms of then understanding the results is that the authors have these very detailed measurements both on what the women in this study actually would have preferred in terms of the treatment, and then also these willingness to pay measures. So in terms of what it finds mechanisms is that the spending spike that happens after making the lump sum treatment, making this lump sum payment after job loss, really comes from those who express strong preferences for monthly payments. And what that implies is that there's probably some demand here for commitment. People realize that they have low commitment, that they have self-control issues, and are sort of aware of that, and it comes from those workers. So let me say a little bit about kind of suggestions that I have. So actually in the presentation, you were much clearer on it, but in your introduction, you sort of state these results are hard to reconcile with canonical models of consumption, smoothing, and job search in the UI literature. And I was thinking, like, what exactly is the canonical result you're referring to here? And also, I guess the UI literature doesn't think so much about, it doesn't even make that statement, right? I don't think it thinks even about like a lump sum transfer in general, since that isn't really so relevant. And I would think that as soon as you're in a world where clearly financial markets are not properly functioning, you could tweak the canonical model just a little bit, and you would I think the expenditure results would be easy to establish, right, in a fairly standard model. So what's super interesting is, and that's of course right, is that this difference in employment, it's really unclear what any kind of theory model that we have right now could say about that. So here I think the interpretation is a little bit tricky, because then when you look at it, it seems to be, I mean, if you were writing down a theory model, you would somehow try to model it as some kind of incentive effect that I can't quite put my hand on what it would be. But then in your data, it seems that it's really kind of a selection effect. There is just this correlation between people who actually had the preference for lump sum payment, and who also wanted to leave manufacturing employment, who expressed that. And so while the result is really interesting to me, that then it's a little bit hard to know, do I think that would generalize or not? Is it just a feature of your sample or not? The other thing that I would have loved to understand a little bit better is this employment shock. So to me, it seems, I mean, I don't work so much on unemployment, but it seems like a very special shock, in the sense there's like one factory that completely closes, yet there are no kind of effects on the local economy. So other firms don't seem to be so affected. So a priori, I would have expected that these workers quite easily can be absorbed into the local economy. So giving just a bit more context on that would have been interesting, also how it compares. I've totally gone over. But it's really fantastic paper. It's very clever, very rich design, as you've also seen from the presentation, and important and interesting results.
So on your 3 points, so the canonical model in the literature, so it's like, so Raschelli has this like 2008 paper, and so, which makes the point to try to disentangle the effect of unemployment insurance from a liquidity to substitution effect, essentially. And so the idea of the liquidity is that, so these are very simple model, everything is smooth, etc. So at job loss, workers would love to essentially borrow against their future income to maintain their consumption, but they can't do that. And so essentially, one thing that UI does, it gives liquidity. And so as a result, workers should, if they have the liquidity, then they should kind of search less. Because what they do is that they don't have the liquidity, so the only way to smooth consumption is to find a job quickly. So job search is kind of too high with that perfect market, because if they had access to the liquidity, they would search less. And so then maybe that we see that job search goes down when people receive UI. It's not necessarily an incentive aspect. It could be a liquidity aspect, access to liquidity. And then empiric, so he has a model to show how you can decompose that. Now to decompose the UI effect nicely between substitution and liquidity, what you need unconditional payment paid in the same way as UI, which is essentially monthly or weekly unconditional payment. That doesn't exist anywhere. And then he has this argument, yeah, but we have variation in lump sum. And essentially, lump sum is going to be kind of the same, because in this model, if you give like money lump sum or like unconditional monthly, essentially it's the same, because there is no fixed cost of any sort, right? And so in this model, they would basically predict the same, and in fact, it was used to kind of estimate this model. So it's very core to this, and there is a ton of papers in high-income countries that there's some papers that show the effect of liquidity, that indeed it reduces job search. But they can't really compare like these two payment modality. And so, so that's the first one. And so yes, so that means explaining the expenditure result is very easy. So we did that with Gerard and Tommy. You just add like sophisticated present bias in the standard model, you get that, but you don't get the wage employment result. For the wage employment result, you need some sort of fixed cost that the lump sum allow you to pay. So in some sense, it has to be an interaction between fixed cost and inability to save on your own to pay the transition out of manufacturing employment. So there is a mix of selection and fixed cost that must be happening there. Yeah, exactly. So that also explains your question about difference in employment result. Maybe we should be clear about this. And in terms of absorption of workers in local factories, basically most of the increase in factory employment, like most of the catch-up, is still in the park, right? So there is a fair amount of absorption, but not 100%. Yeah.
Thanks. Super interesting. Given what I've heard both from Stefano and Stefan, and then the other day from the movie, that people don't like these jobs, I guess I'm curious if there's any effect of how long people have been at the factory by the time they get laid off. So and some people tolerate these jobs enough that they get used to it, and I expect the people who had been there for a year might come back to manufacturing more quickly than the ones who are in for a couple months and decide, look, this is not what I want to do anyway. And so I'm curious whether there's any.
Yeah. So I think, so the workers, sorry, there was another question. Yeah.
Thank you. My question was if you could say a bit more about the savings technology. I wasn't sure, and I'm sorry I haven't read the paper, but I wasn't sure whether we should think of this as a story about self-control or about heterogeneity and ability to save. Because
Okay.
you said yourself that it's got to be some story here about an inability to save.
Yeah. So let me take the second question first. So when we elicit willingness to accept or to pay for the monthly versus the lump sum, among the people who choose monthly, then we ask them, okay, why? It's an open question that we can then categorize. And the key answer is like controlling expenditure. Then you see a little bit about like pressure to give to my network, a little bit on theft, but that's it. So these are the key things. So saving technology, well, that interact a lot with like prison bias and this kind of stuff, right? So saving technology could be like, the technology is there, they have bank accounts, right? So it's not as if they don't have a place where they could leave money, but it could be that you're, in practice, if I have a lot of savings, I have a lot of demand, or I'm just gonna spend it. So that's the first thing. The second, now, remind me briefly. Yeah, so I think most of the workers, so they have like between 1 and 2 years of tenure, I think. Some maybe a bit shorter, not that many with more than that. We didn't actually look at that specifically. That's it. Yeah, I think that's potentially interesting. So I think the fact that people like basically leave very quickly suggests that indeed there is at least a group of people that they don't love these jobs, and if you give them the means of leaving, then they leave. But still, among like the job search result, it's all about like jobs in our essentially. So people, at least in the short run, if they have to look for kind of more stable jobs, they still look in the park, right? So I think it's really it's a complex story, right? Maybe these are not the most amazing jobs that everyone should really want to be there, but at the same time they provide like means of living. Maybe it's a stepping stone to something. Like, I mean, as we were just discussing, people are queuing to get these jobs, and at the same time, once they get them, it's not a dream neither. So I think it's a mix of two, and that's the reality. I mean, the whole history of like structural transformation is often this kind of intermediate generation that kind of like they step out of the traditional like economy. Maybe their life is not fantastic, and maybe for the children, then it starts becoming like something different. A lot of workers aspire to like not be in the park 5 years down the road, right? So they really see that as a stepping stone to something else.
Hello, thank you for being here. I am Paolo Falco, and I am at the University of Copenhagen, and very excited to present this project today, to the point that I would normally be jumping around about it. I cannot, because my doctor will get very upset. I am recovering from knee surgery, so I'll have to move a little bit more slowly than usual. Having said that, this is a joint project with Roberta Gatti and Asif Islam at the World Bank, and Andreas Hensel, who is at the University of Padua. And in this project, what we're trying to do is address a very old question in economics for the first time through an experiment. Essentially, going back to Becker himself, there is this theory that is very well known in economics, according to which if you put firms in a more competitive environment, and by that I mean competitive environment in a sense of output competition, more firms competing for a given market to sell a given good, they will have to shed some of their biases and some of their discriminatory practices in hiring simply because they cannot afford that anymore. At least that's how the original theory based on taste-based discrimination will go. So as competition increases, employers will no longer afford to indulge a certain discriminatory taste, and therefore you would expect that they would be less biased in their hiring of workers. We offer an experimental test of this hypothesis, of this mechanism, and I'll tell you in a second how we're going to achieve that. What we ask essentially is, do employers, when faced with higher competition, everything else equal, change their hiring decisions towards less discriminatory practices? And in this context, let me give it away straight away, it's going to be gender bias in hiring. Do they react, therefore, to competition consistent with the aforementioned hypothesis? And where do we do this? We do this in Egypt. And we do this in Egypt because it's a context where, as you know, there are massive issues of low female labor force participation, which is, of course, by no means entirely ascribable to discriminatory practices by the employers, but there is a strong hunch that the traditional norms are such that some employers may prefer that some employers would rather hire men than women based on some kind of norms and some kind of tastes for a given position, controlling for everything else. How are we going to test this hypothesis? We're going to run a field experiment with real managers of small, medium, and large firms, and we're going to have them make incentivized hiring decisions for a real job, and we're going to be exogenously varying the number of competitors that they face in the setup that we create. Crucially, the payoffs of these managers will depend on the productivity of the workers that they hire vis-a-vis their competitors. And let me make it very clear in a minute what I mean by all this, but at an abstract level for now, this is exactly what you imagine we should be doing in this context. We have employers making decisions, we manipulate the level of competition, and their payoffs depend on the productivity of the workers they choose. So we're going to put them in a competitive situation where the aim of the game is finding essentially the most productive worker out of a lot of workers that we give them in order to beat each other at a certain competition. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that in a second. Just keep it in your mind for now. What do we find? We find that competition, when we expose employers to greater competition, increases the hiring of women as opposed to a condition without a competitive setting. And when we test mechanisms, we also find that when we reveal, or at least give a very strong signal of the productivity of the workers to these employers, in order to resolve issues of asymmetric information that may lead to the kinds of problems that economists generally refer to as statistical discrimination, the effect of competition does not change. Essentially consistent with the hypothesis that this is something that goes via taste-based discrimination and not so much via statistical discrimination. I'll be more precise on that in a second. We also have some heterogeneity analysis that is essentially consistent with the idea that people who are more traditional in their backgrounds will be affected more by this treatment because presumably they have stronger tastes and preferences that competition can move. On the contributions, what are we trying to do here? How do we contribute to the literature? Essentially, we provide an experimental test to a hypothesis that's been on a lot of people's minds for a while. Essentially, there is already an important literature that tries to test what happens to hiring practices the moment that markets become more competitive. The issue with that literature, that is a very rich one and a very important one, and certainly studies have done their best to address this question with quasi-random variation, quasi-experimental variation, and so on, is the issue of endogeneity and the confounders that happen. Essentially, when you open a market to trade, when you make a market more competitive, when you increase competition, there are things other than competition itself that change. The product mix may change, you may need workers with different skills, so it's not obvious that you're actually keeping things fixed. And in addition, we shed light on taste versus statistical discrimination, so a mechanism story, and add to the literature on the Middle East and discrimination in that context, which is a growing one. But the really main important contribution here is an experimental test of the key hypothesis itself. And I'm sure you guys are wondering, I can see it from your faces, how are you going to manipulate competition? And that's exactly what we're going to do next. And that's the gist of the presentation. What we're doing is, and here's where I want you to pay attention, we're partnering with a real company that needs to make real hires in Cairo, Egypt. The company puts out a call for applications, gets applicants, shortlists them, and then hands over the shortlist to us. And they tell us, you guys recommend workers we need to hire out of these. What we then do is we go to 500 employers of real firms, 500 managers of real firms in Egypt, and we ask them, can you please make hiring recommendations out of this shortlist for the workers that should be hired in this job? The job is a data entry desk-based job that is very akin to, you could say, secretarial work in a lot of the firms that we hire. It's basically a simple white-collar function that they can easily relate to. And here's the trick. Through this design feature, we can now manipulate the competition between employers. In one condition, the employers are simply making this decision, choosing the workers that they want to hire, knowing that one of them will be randomly implemented for real, so the worker will actually go and work, and based on their productivity, they're going to get a certain payoff, independently of any other employer's decision. In another condition, we tell them, pick your preferred worker, but bear in mind that there is another employer making the same decision, albeit with a similar but different set of workers. The one between you that picks the best worker wins this competition and makes a profit. The other one doesn't. Which is a way of essentially creating a setting that has the features of, you could say, Bertrand competition on prices, where firms are trying to be as productive as possible in order to keep the prices lowest based on the productivity of their workers and win the market. That is our attempt to move competition in this context. More details. Each manager makes 6 decisions over 6 quadruplets of workers. Essentially, they see 4 workers every time. They're different in each one of these sets, and they have to choose their preferred one. What do they see about these workers? Some very basic information, basic for reasons to do with having to keep things under control. They see their gender, education, their marital status, number of children. And they know that one of these decisions is ultimately implemented for real. So we tell them, we'll pick one of your decisions at random, and this worker will actually be hired in this firm. Another important thing to bear in mind here, they are not competing over workers. They are seeing the same sets, and they could be choosing the same worker. We tell them explicitly, if this happens, you're going to split the difference. You're going to split the payoff. So it's not competition in the labor market, it's competition on the productivity of the workers, which in our mind is something that replicates what happens on the output market. In the end, we can hire up to all the 24 workers if they're chosen by at least one of these employers. And these workers work for real, we see their productivity, and we pay the employers based on the productivity of these workers in the real firm. Hopefully that's clear. The treatments, so the manipulations. There is a baseline with no competition, as I already told you. There is a T1 treatment with one competitor, a T2 where you have 4 other competitors. Essentially the same thing, but we tell you there is only one other person or 4 other people making the same decision at the same time as you, and the one among you that picks the best worker wins. And these are manipulations that occur, and I'll show you more in a second, within subjects. So across the 6 decisions, competition changes. That's a heck of a lot for people to process, and that's why, as part of our analysis, the first thing we're going to do is do an analysis on first decisions, the first thing that people see. And so the main headline result that comes out of this is something as simple as the first time they choose this, and there is a between subject variation where some people get competition, some people don't. I'll also show you the within variation, but things get a little bit more complicated than that, but to a first approximation, the results hold. Additional manipulations very quickly. I won't have a lot to tell you about this for lack of time, but we also, introduce a productivity signal between subject variation. Essentially, in some conditions, in some subjects, you could say, reveal productivity. We tell them essentially how productive these workers were at the very same job in an interview we did at baseline. This is to lift uncertainty and shut down the potential channel of statistically discrimination-driven discrimination in the story. We test the difference between hiring for a supervisory role versus non-supervisory role, and we also vary a little bit the amount of money per item produced by these workers in the job, just so that we are not married to a given calibration of the model, and we can see how things change when we jack up or reduce the incentive a bit. I will not have anything to say on that for now, but it's just for completeness. This is the design, what it looks like. Very, very quickly, just to give you a sense. An employer from the top enters into the survey. They're randomized, first of all, between subjects into having versus not having productivity shown about these workers. There is a certain level of incentive. That means how much money per item, per widget produced by this worker. It's going to be per line of data entry correctly entered by the worker they produce. And then they are in one of these streams. Some of them get T0 first, and then T1 and T2. That's no productivity, no competition, competition against 1, competition against 4. Some other get the competition first. And within each treatment, there is supervisory versus non-supervisory roles. That's something, again, we're not going to cover for lack of time, but you see the sense of what we're doing here. Very briefly on the sample. 500 employers, randomly selected from Cairo. Through, broadly speaking, random walk sampling, you can think of this as approaching firms based on their location, and ultimately trying to match the World Bank Enterprise Survey for the country such that we had 270 very small firms, 155 medium-sized, and 75 large firms across sectors. All of these firms, the first approximation, have a secretary. And we're thinking about this type of white-collar job in the job that we create. What do they look like? They're mostly men, largely men, as you can imagine, average age 38. Not a lot to learn from this. It's there for completeness. The workers. Our partner firm advertises this office job. It's a temporary job. That's another important thing. Hopefully it was on the slide earlier and you picked it up. 600 applicants, 103 interviewed, 24 shortlisted. Candidates' productivity tested at baseline. And we ultimately create the shortlist. This is what it looked like. This is a job, by the way, where it's common to have female working, so it's by no means weird that we have shortlisted both men and women. And they're a little bit younger than entrepreneurs themselves and typically have high school or just above. The job. It's a full-time temporary job entering data. It's in person in office, mixed gender office, we make it very clear, so we control for that concern. It's in a safe place, no concerns about men or women showing up differentially. In fact, they don't, so there's no concern of that kind. You should really be thinking here, if you're an employer in our sample, about the productivity of the workers, not whether they'll show up. It's in the same location as where they did the interview, so they know where it's going to be. Results. I don't need to show you too much about this, but essentially, for every candidate in one of those quadruplets, clustering obviously carefully at the employer level, we test whether the productivity of being hired changes by an interaction of their gender and whether or not they're in a competition regime. So if female in competition condition are hired more, that's an evidence of impact. And indeed, that's what we see. Decision number 1, purely between subject. When you compare those who are in a treated condition with a competitor versus no competitor, what changes is that we close essentially a gap, which is originally of about 10 percentage points, whereby women will be hired with 45% probability versus men with 55% probability, and it pretty much goes to 0, as in that gap goes to 0. That's the headline result. When we explore mechanisms, and I'm going fast obviously for lack of time, but I'm sure we'll have questions, we get a picture that is a little bit more complicated essentially for issues of power. When we try the same thing first two columns, between subject analysis and essentially just control for whether or not the signal was shown, the bulk of the result is that the impact of competition is unchanged, but it becomes insignificant. It becomes insignificant, but it's exactly the same coefficient. It becomes insignificant because in a between subject analysis, power is too low. When we move to the within subject analysis, the same thing holds, including the signal, and that's something you see in column 5. Doesn't change anything compared to column 4, but we need to be a little bit more careful in the way we analyze this, essentially for the following reason. If you just do a within subject analysis in column 3, you see nothing. Why is that? Because we discovered that going from no competition to competition is not symmetrical to going from competition to no competition. In a within subject analysis, the coefficient will pick up things going in those two directions. It turns out that only once you split in column 4 and you control for the direction in which you're going, you find the result that is consistent with the between subject analysis, as in we see that going from no competition to some competition gives you an effect. In that world, in that column, once you then add the signal, you see that things don't change. I don't want to confuse you here. This is too detailed for this presentation. Happy to take questions. What I quickly want to show you in the 1 minute I have left is that employers who are most moved by this are the ones that by some general sense of their broad characteristics would appear to be a little bit more conservative, older, wealthier. We also have some additional metrics that are not necessarily in here now. And we think that that's consistent with the idea that these ones could be the ones that have a certain taste that can be moved by the treatment. And then we don't see a lot on the supervisory versus non-supervisory role. I'll leave it at that. The final point I want to make is that for this story of taste-based discrimination to go through, and we have a model in the paper to show it, you essentially have to rely on the following. The employers that in theory should be moved by this type of exercise are employers who think that women are more productive, or at least not less productive, but due to their taste, they will still prefer, in the absence of competition, to hire men. We can test this with data that we have from the survey. We ask people, who do you think among these candidates who is going to be the most productive? And we find that the effect is entirely driven, as predicted by the theory, by those who believe that women are the best candidates, and yet, in the absence of competition, they would hire them less. Let me conclude by just telling you what we did here, which is running a field experiment with managers of small, medium, and large enterprises in Cairo. We had incentivized hiring decisions. We exogenously varied competition, and we found that in higher competition regimes, hiring goes more towards women than otherwise, closing a gap that otherwise exists. The evidence that we analyze in the paper is such that we believe this is a story that goes primarily through preferences, and we believe this corroborates the idea that competition and competition policy can serve as an anti-discrimination tool. Thank you.
Let me then discuss this great paper. So I think we were told not to summarize the paper, but it's a bit dry not to do that. So it's not a summary. This is what I like about the paper. So I think it has a very clever experimental test of this kind of traditional prediction of Becker 1957. Does competition discipline discrimination away, essentially? And I think one thing is that the setting is probably as careful and meaningful as a lab experiment in the field can be. I think that was quite clear from the presentation. It's a very clever way to try to test this with some stakes. And then it focused on a very specific mechanism. Which is about like reduction in preference-based discrimination for a given set of employers. So that means that it's not going to be about direct interaction with employees, because that employee doesn't actually end up working with that employer. And it's also not about whether the customers care about who is providing services, for example. The experimental setting also try to eliminate most of what I call excuses for selective hiring, like where you might think that, oh, actually this job is not appropriate for a woman. And then they have a clean test for this alternative story, whether maybe if there is more competition, what you end up doing, you end up screening better candidates, and basically then don't rely as much on statistical discrimination, right? So statistical discrimination means that you rely on mean differences or perceived mean differences across groups. But if you were to really like invest in screening, you could actually extract the true information about a candidate and not just able to rely on this. Now I have 2 slides essentially, one with bigger comments and suggestions. So the first one, I think because it's neat, I would make the paper as sharp and short as possible. Go for short paper output because it's going to speak to a lot of economists. So I think it's going to be well received. That means essentially your presentation. So let go of the model at the end. Let go of this difference between non-supervised and supervisor because that's actually quite weak compared to everything else you have. I mean, it's not clear that this is such a meaningful difference in responsibilities, etc. The second one, I was a little bit puzzled about the econometric model. So you have an OLS with employer fixed effect, even in the between subject. But in the between subject, it's one employer making a choice. And it's true there are 4 candidates, so you have 4 observations, but they are not independent. There's still just one choice. So I think the right specification here is basically to tell your software, well, only one of these 4 can be selected. And right now you can run the regression, but the software doesn't know that, doesn't know the structure of your data. So I don't know if it matters, but it looks to me like this is more like a typical I/O setting where customers are choosing a car and there are different attributes, and then you pick a discrete choice model for that. Then I think so you have this clever variation in signal, and I think people also believe that statistical discrimination matter. But all the discussion that you provide is about whether it changes the competition effect. And at least I was a little bit lost in the table 3 that you showed. It looks like, I'm not sure whether the signal also affects hiring, selective hiring. I think that would be very interesting per se, because having, again, this very neat test of these competing stories side by side, it's kind of nice. And, you know, for example, it would be very interesting to show that both competition and the signal matter, and still there is no interaction. And I think that seems to be kind of what's happening there. If that's true, that is kind of nice because it's not obvious to rationalize that in the kind of models that we would have. So I think the fact that there would be no interaction between the two. So I don't know, I think I would actually invest in that. And then the incentive strength, again, you focus on whether it changed the competition result and not per se. And then also you talk a lot about productivity differences, but there is very little in the paper that I could find about, okay, what is actually the level of heterogeneity here among these different workers? Does it really matter? And then you have this table 3 with a specification with competition and reduction. You said, I'm not going to really go into detail about what we do here because it's complicated. In the paper, I couldn't figure it out. So I think you need to explain better this. And, you know, if I have just 1 minute, yeah, clarification, you know, is the expected payoff for employers the same? Given that when there is more competition, I have less of a chance to win. Does it mean that on average, I'm going to win less? I don't know if that matters. Did the experimental decision matter at all? Because you say the firm can hire approximately 20, and then you have 24 candidates. So, I mean, I understand the stakes would still be relevant even if everyone was hired, because it depends who you picked for your payoff, but I don't know. The lead review, I think that's important. You kind of highlight all of these papers that struggle to hold constant the sets of tasks and the market. Well, actually, we have a bunch of papers on the English football and discrimination, and that's a good setting. I think that's the closest literature for you because, well, the competition didn't change. The task is the same, and still the competition and the structure changed with the Bosman change in 1995, etc. So I think these papers are actually the one that you should cite prominently. And then in the paper, you should explain earlier the fact that you focus on gender discrimination, and especially the second bullet point, like what's the nature of the job? What do you mean by incentive? What do you mean by signal? It shows up on page 12, and that's too much suspense for a paper. And then I think, again, when you say like it has no impact on our competition result, sometimes change precision, so at least, discuss that a little bit. But otherwise, very clever experimental setting.
Let me provide a couple of answers. So, of course, inevitably papers change, and I was aware of the fact that the part on table 3 here will be a little bit murky. The new draft is already a lot clearer. It was already on our mind. But super well taken, of course. That is really a key point. Now on I quite liked the point about showing the value of the signal despite the lack of a change in the effect of competition. We do see that. It was too quick, but the last column in that table shows you that the signal does not change the effect of competition on gender bias, despite it being used by the employers, and very much so. These employers see the signal and they hire more on average people with higher signals, so the signal is clearly relevant, but they don't do so in a gender biased way once you throw in competition in the story. So that absolutely, and we should probably make more of that. And very quickly on the point about the specification, I would like to discuss that more, and I think your suggestion is very clever. What I'm thinking about is that also in the table we should be clear about the fact that the reason that we have those fixed effects in there and they seem odd, we have employer fixed effect and the changes between subject in treatment only allows us to look at the interaction term, and the constant isn't there anymore. It's a stylistic choice. I find that sometimes it confuses people. We may want to change that, but absolutely, point well taken. And absolutely, all the other comments are also super useful on the additional details we need, show more on competition, and adding more reference to relevant literatures. Thank you so much.
Question. Suppose you and I are judges. Under what circumstances do I need to worry about what I think you're going to do? And I can think of two reasons. One is I didn't quite get the point about splitting the payoff if we make the same choice. But even if that's somehow incentive compatible, is it possible that I look at a great candidate like Julian here and I think, well, everyone's going to go for Julian. He's going to get a job. So I'm going to pick a diamond in the rough because I like the candidate or I empathize with a particular profile. I doubt it's driving your results, but just in terms of the clarity of the design, I'm wondering how much we should discount that kind of interference.
Absolutely. That's a very good point, and I'll answer very quickly, but I'm happy to discuss it separately. It comes up sometimes. It's an issue of the average versus the variance as well of these choices, depending on what kind of decision you're making. We believe that the theory we worked out is such that if on average, at least in the simplest competition setting, it should be enough to go for the higher expected value candidate, but happy to discuss that because it's a bit more complicated than this. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm Lukas Hensel, and I'm going to present joint work with Kate Orkin, who's based here at Oxford, Jennifer Cadiz, who's now at Rand, and Rob Garlick at Duke. And I'm going to present on employer screening technology and hiring. So we're still kind of working out the exact title of the working paper once we make it final, but yeah. And our motivation is like a very straightforward one in a way. That is that if we could only make hiring processes more efficient, we could potentially increase total employment and increase hiring numbers. That's kind of an implication of the canonical search and matching model essentially in the labor market literature, but then also more kind of recent models on mismatch between workers' skills and job requirements show that mismatch is actually quite costly, mismatch in the labor market. And while there's adjustment over time and workers reallocate to jobs that match their skills better, overall there's quite a bit of mismatch in the economy. So it's both the kind of these frictions really seem to have important welfare consequences. At the same time, there has been a raise, a really big increase in centralized hiring processes, in particular online job search platforms that are very common in rich countries and high-income countries, but also increasingly so in middle and lower-income countries. And this centralized hiring processes have the advantage that they can, for example, increase the inclusion of disadvantaged groups who struggle to access labor markets in particular low and middle income countries where network-based hiring is very prevalent. However, in practice, a lot of these platforms are leave employers with very long lists of applicants that are often very undifferentiated. So especially if firms advertise relatively popular formal jobs, they get very long lists of applicants, and you'll see that in our setting as well, that they really struggle to select from. They really don't know who to even invite for interviews of those lists. So what we do in this paper is that we provide evidence that we can improve employer screening technology like at the very beginning of the hiring process, essentially. So we're going to talk about shortlisting, which then kind of like enables firms to identify more suitable candidates or more suitable candidates and increase overall hiring numbers. To do so, we partner with the largest recruitment agency or like job search service or like job service provider in South Africa. And like we partner with them on like in kind of helping them service their partners with shortlists of applicants, essentially. These vacancies that we work with, like for one, they get a lot of applicants. So these are very like popular jobs. These are kind of formal sector entry-level jobs that are extremely popular. You can see we have 650 applicants on average. They often are willing to make more than one hire. Like the average, like they are looking to fill a number of positions for each vacancy. So it's not just like one hire. And then what we do is we randomize at the vacancy level. So like this is a firm-facing intervention if you want. Mostly at the end, I'll have a short bit on job seeker-facing interventions as well. And what we vary is basically how do we create the shortlist that we pass on to these firms. This is kind of our key, like the key intervention that we have here. The traditional control group in our study is basically using the status quo algorithm where candidates are just short listed based on 3 criteria, essentially. Proximity to the location, so they have a functional form, kind of how far do you actually live from the job. That really matters in the South African labor market. It's a strong predictor of retention and so on. Education, so both kind of the level, but also performance, school grades, and so on. And finally, work experience. So this is something that our partner kind of worked out, this algorithm. This is what they've been doing. And what we then add to it is we augment this traditional shortlisting algorithm by adding an additional component based on soft skills. So we measure candidate soft skills, I'll be more precise, and then add this into the algorithm and see whether like vacancies that are presented with a shortlist generated partially based on soft skills generates more overall hires. This is a natural experiment. So we work kind of with the intermediary. Neither the job seekers nor their firms know that they're being treated, essentially. They obviously cooperate with our partner, but they just know kind of that they're presented with a like short list of candidates that like our partner thinks are kind of good matches for the vacancy. And then what we measure, our main outcomes are hiring and like preliminary stages during the hiring process. And then we have earnings and retention of the workers in the that were hired. Finally, what we do is, because we experimentally vary the shortlists, we can actually exactly know which job seekers were displaced from these job lists. So we know exactly, like in the counterfactual allocation, which workers would have been on the job lists. So we can exactly identify the job seekers who were displaced. So we have kind of a unique setting to study spillover effects, not necessarily at the market level, because like we don't know, we are not studying jobs like spillovers from one vacancy to another, but we can kind of say, what are the displacement effects? What happens to the job seekers who are, by this algorithm, kind of like led to have like one opportunity less, essentially. What do we find? Well, we find the firms or vacancies that get presented with shortlists that take into account soft skills hire more. So treated vacancies issue 23% more interview invitations and end up making 35% more actual hires. And they, like what we find suggestive evidence on, like that's something that we're still working on, is they don't seem to be decreasing hires through other platforms. This is something like our data there is still a bit incomplete. So, but what we see so far is we find no evidence of decreases of hiring through other platforms. In terms of selection of workers, we find that they look very similar. Like There are some kind of demographic differences that I'll get into, but in terms of wages, retention, and so on, they like look to be of similar quality. The differences that we find are on other dimensions, in particular, like the key dimensions where we find kind of an increase in hiring rates is among inexperienced job seekers. So this leads to increased hiring, like of a higher increase in the rate of hiring for increased job seekers. Not so much on gender, on age, like we depends a bit on the specification. We see sometimes few effects, but it's not very robust. And then in terms of the spillover, so looking at the candidates that were displaced, basically we find no negative search effects once we take out, like we find no negative effects on search behavior. And in terms of employment outcomes and so on, we only see kind of the direct negative effect of missing out on that one opportunity. So like if we look on average, compare them, they are less likely to be employed. But once we take into account that like they actually had just one opportunity less, then kind of there's no difference anymore. So there doesn't seem, there only seem to be this direct displacement effect and not any additional spillovers through discouragement or similar channels. So I'll be pretty quick on the contribution in the interest of time. But basically, I think like our key contribution is to study hiring responses to improved screening technology, taking out kind of the job seeker margin. So this is not like, there are lots of these signaling studies, and a lot of us have worked on these, including here, including myself, but this is not that, because this is not about signaling, this is really about kind of selecting job seekers through the process in an exogenous way. Job seekers can't really react to the treatment. They don't know that they're treated. Firms don't know that they're treated either. So like this is really kind of a pure test of this increased matching efficiency algorithms through soft skills. And then the second contribution that we think is interesting, and I'd be curious to hear your opinion on kind of how interesting you find this, is basically identifying spillover effects on job seekers by specifically looking at the job seekers that were displaced. So not at a population or market level, but really at the individual level, because we know exactly who the displaced job seekers are. Okay, let me get a bit to the context. We work in South Africa in like mostly formal and urban labor markets. So like in this context, like self-employment is not very high. Wage labor is the main source of income. And these entry-level jobs that we work with, they're mostly in services and manufacturing, informal firms, some are even public sector jobs. So some, but like these are really kind of mostly formal jobs, not all of them, but most of them are formal jobs, always like basically informal firms. The context is one with very high unemployment rates and turnover as well. So like the unemployment rate often is in South Africa, it's over 30%. In our population, like disadvantaged, mostly black youth, we go like to almost 45% or so. It depends a bit like how you draw the boundaries. But this is like in the context of extreme like unemployment. At the same time, firms really struggle to identify well-matched workers. We know that like in this context, but also in other contexts, like giving workers credible signals of their skills increases employment at the individual level. So that's good. But these studies don't really study like the net hiring effect essentially. So they don't know whether like overall employment changed or not. They can really look at displacement effects. We also know that firms are willing to pay for information about soft skills. The Carranza et al. Paper has like a willingness to pay exercise for this, and firms show some demand for the soft skills. One thing that's not on here, but what we see actually, like firms also struggle to fill some of the vacancies, which is like we have really high unemployment rates. But if we look at vacancy filling rates in our study, and we have some measurement error, but we find vacancy filling rates of like, even if we like account for attrition or so with relatively like strong assumptions of 60%, 65% or so, like you'll see in our data, the way I showed you, it's even lower than that. So like the vacancy filling rates are actually not very high. Firms like in this segment, these firms really struggle to find suitable entry-level workers. Yeah, and as I said, we work with the largest youth employment service provider in South Africa. They have 4 million registered users, 1.35 million active users who've used the platform in the last 6 months. They are kind of really the main player. They claim to have signed up like 60 to 70% of unemployed youth in South Africa. Part of their success, part of the reason for their success is they're free to use. So you can even use them when you don't have any data on your phone, which is very important to job seekers because data is very expensive. Our intervention is very simple. We randomize at the vacancy level basic which algorithm we use to generate the shortlists. And employers see like either 20 applicants on the shortlist or 4 times the target hires. So if they wanted to hire more than 5 people, we would kind of top up the shortlists accordingly. And what do firms actually see? I put this on here because Paolo, like we had this discussion earlier already. We basically, like they get sent an Excel sheet with like a rank of the candidate's name, proximity from opportunity, and candidate ID number, which has information about age and gender. They get contact information and like essentially the exact address. And they have the opportunity to add custom questions. So like not all firms do that, but they can ask very specific question. This one is, yeah, I'm not actually sure where I took like what this exact opportunity was, but you can say they ask for qualifications, they ask for criminal record, they ask for the exact location. Again, like they could have, the last question they could have gotten from the standardized thing, but this is kind of what firms end up seeing essentially. They just get an Excel list. There's no signal about soft skills in there. I think that's important. Firms don't actually see kind of the skills nor of workers. They may observe some experiences, like experience, qualifications. If they have some questions, like open text questions, some firms do, they may infer something about soft skills, but it's not information that we provide to them. And the way we measure everything is we follow up with job seekers. So we know exactly who was shortlisted, and we basically contact everyone who was shortlisted after the closing date of the vacancy, essentially. We give them a bit of time for things to work out, and we know when firms kind of want to finish the hiring process, and then we reach out to job seekers, ask them, were you invited to the interview? Like, did you attend it? Did you get a job offer? What did you do, essentially? We do this for both kind of shortlisted applicants and for those who were displaced as well. We also have like platform data, so the search behavior on platform, and so like how active they were, how many applications they sent, and so on. We don't see too much on there that's interesting for the spillover analysis mostly. So talking about soft skills, like why did we choose to add soft skills? One is kind of the very practical reason our policy partner, like they really wanted to study soft skills because they felt like formal qualifications were really disadvantaging a large group of inexperienced job seekers, and they really wanted to kind of help them enter the labor market. But we also have reason to believe that like soft skills are linked to job performance, and that like firms actually value these skills. What are our measures? We like piloted a lot, and these are the 3 that we kind of found to be most predictive of both job search, but also like on the job performance and like in terms of earnings and so on. So like we did a lot of iterations. We adapted these to the local context. So what we have here, what we end up using is not the exact wording from the original sources, but they are adapted to the local context. Grit is like resilience, growth mindset is like essentially how much do you think you can change your skills? Behavioral activation is something about proactivity. How active are you in everyday life and doing tasks and so on? And these were self-administered on the SAU's platform. they are correlated, but not perfectly. We will summarize all three of them in one index. And there are no important ceiling effects. We have some evidence that the gaming is not an issue, which I imagine many of you would be worried about. And then they rolled this awesome platform. They have more than 1 million people who've filled in these questionnaires now, and the psychometric properties and levels reported are kind of stable over time as these skills were rolled out. So these seem to work quite well overall. I'll just leave it here. On average, they want firms want to hire 7 positions. You can see in Windsor, more than 600 applications, and then the number of shortlisted applicants. This is wrong. That's the number of ranked applicants. So it's eligible applicants. They're not actually the shortlisted ones. It's a wrong label here. So these are the ones who are kind of meeting the eligibility criteria of the firm. I'll have to go ahead a bit. So I'll split the specifications just at the vacancy level. So we aggregate everything at the vacancy level. And we find first stage works. We have less experienced job seekers on the final job list, but higher soft skill ones. And what we see is, this is our main results table. Yeah, I'm going a bit too slow. But we see an increase in interview invitations, an increase in interview attendance, then increase in received job offers, accepted job offers, and also in started jobs. What you can kind of see, the funnel, the ratio doesn't really change too much to the control mean. So it's all driven by this initial increase in interview invitations. And then afterwards, the kind of funnel from once you're invited to actually starting a job or to accepting a job offer remains relatively constant across the two groups. Here, here we look both at total earnings and average earnings. I just want to say, on average, these workers don't earn less than the existing workers. They have they are not more likely to leave early, though so far we only have the short follow-up. We see a slight increase in the relative effect size for inexperienced workers relative to experienced workers, but overall, even demographically, it's not that different if we look at the relative effect sizes. We have one more treatment arm where we don't discount the traditional criteria completely and just rank based on distance and soft skills, so no education or experience. And we find that actually leads to positive point estimates, but substantially smaller ones. So that at least doesn't seem to be adding very much, suggesting that maybe it's important to have the traditional criteria in the mix. And then in terms of spillovers, I'll just tell you that basically there are no spillovers. The orange effects are net of the direct hire effect. So if you take account based for the fact that some job seekers were actually hired for these opportunities that we shortlisted for, there are no significant spillovers anymore on labor market outcomes, but neither on any of the search outcomes. Okay. This is my conclusion slide because this is very much work in progress. So I'm not concluding, I'm talking about next steps. And basically one of the big questions that we're still trying to figure out is, why do firms actually invite more candidates in the first place? Because they don't actually see the soft skills, right? So they must see something in the list on the candidates that leads them to invite more. Maybe our best lead is currently these custom questions. They're a bit hard to analyze, but that's kind of next up. We have kind of heterogeneity. We can do a bit more. We see it's actually the big vacancies that drive these hiring effects. It's not the small ones. We're currently working on a follow-up about potential longer run effects. And we are also working on firm data, like hiring outside the experiment for hiring through other platforms. We have some data already, but getting firm data is proving to be quite challenging. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukas. So one drawback of hanging out with the presenter of the paper you're discussing before the presentation is that you've given away most of your points already. So I can be somewhat brief and also save a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So this is a great project, super interesting question, important questions. We know that soft skills matter. We don't know yet how much they matter for the matching process, and this is a great experiment dealing specifically with that. And the gist of it is that the authors include soft skills in the algorithm that selects candidates, and they find evidence that leads to better matches, essentially more interviews and more extended offers. I have some points on mechanisms and some big picture points. So this is something Lukas already touched on. It's plausible to believe that more information leads to better matches. After all, you're adding more information to the mix. You find that, this match is better in the sense that they get more offers and so on. But how does this actually play out? It's a little bit of a puzzle, because the employers don't see any of this information. They only see a different set of candidates, and they then decide to extend more offers. But these candidates just look like a list of names, and they don't have any other information than perhaps what's in that ID number, which is just age and gender. So it's not clear to me how to think about the mechanism that actually leads to this, but by all means something worth exploring and super interesting. One thing I was thinking about is that they may be using some of those additional optional questions in ways that you may not have explored yet. Maybe you may find that some of those additional questions are actually something that then differentiates in the eye of the employers the ones that have been selected through one algorithm or the other. Could they also be contacting these candidates prior to you recording the information on the platform? Probably not. I imagine, some kind of preliminary phone call that then leads to this offer being extended or not, and that may be something that then reveals a little bit more about these candidates. And then I have a point about the counterfactual analysis. I take the point that once the displacement effect that is directly coming from not being on the list is taken account of, you don't see displacement effects. But could you actually have do you have sufficient power, so to speak, to be able to detect those effects? And it's not even a power issue. Is your expectation that the treatment is strong enough to have such displacement effects on the broader population? In a sense, other than that direct effect, should there be another plausible spillover effect of a negative kind on the general population? And then some big picture points. So if this is a big deal, why aren't employers doing it already? And then the follow-up question to that is, in the real world, is this costly for employers to do? You tested it very neatly. They go through a questionnaire, you test their soft skills. Is it a problem of this being not accessible, something that the employers don't know, or is it difficult to do it credibly? Who knows who is filling out that questionnaire online? Is it really the employee himself or herself, or is it someone else? And then finally, if we were to scale this up, should we worry about soft skills being something that people have as sort of an innate trait that is difficult to change? I know there's literature showing that you can change those skills, but I'd like some discussion on that, because there could be an issue of displacement effects going against people who are just disadvantaged by not having these soft skills by way of their upbringing or something like that, and that may create more inequality. That's just a general point. I'll leave it to that, and hopefully I don't have my watch with me, but we may have time for one or two questions. But if you want to address these comments first or take the questions, feel free, whatever.
I will take the question. I'll very quickly respond. Thank you. So for the outreach to firms, we actually also asked a stage earlier, did you receive any message from the firm? This only started 20% into the study or so, but we don't see it's the same effect. Basically, outreach and interview invitations almost perfectly correlate. There's very few firms that kind of reach out before inviting for interview. So that doesn't really seem to be driving it. Counterfactual effects, I think that's a very good point, because most of these job seekers, they don't lose anything. They wouldn't have been contacted by the firm in the first place. So by not being on the job on the shortlist, they don't really lose out. So I think we need to do a bit of back of the envelope calculation of kind of how big would the discouragement effect have to be in a way, or conversely the encouragement effect of having been invited for an interview or something like that. That we can absolutely do. I think this is a great point. Why the employers don't do it already? That's also a good question. But broadly speaking, they even the big corporates who are well managed, or have these large scale hiring processes, they do interviews, they do a mass test, they do an English test, but they don't do any of this psychometric tests essentially. It may also be that kind of if you ask for these scales in this very specific hiring context, maybe like they perform a bit worse. So like, because like here they ask when they sign up to the platform or when they like log in for the first time after a while to the platform, and not at the time of application. So they are like elicited in a somewhat more neutral context. So that may play a role as well. And then in terms of scale up, it is actually being scaled up. So like they are using this on the platform now for all their vacancies. So in that sense, it's a big policy win, which is great. It's like, interestingly, like we find that for 50% of the vacancies, our algorithm doesn't even change who is on the shortlist, but just shuffles the ranks within like the top people, essentially. So there is, for a lot of the vacancies, they are just like, there's a somewhat smallish set of really kind of outstanding people who you differentiate between a bit, but it's not necessarily just like that someone who was very low ranked suddenly is ranked up very high. So this is, I don't think that like the disadvantage of people with very low soft skills are like would actually be so important. Yeah, I think this is what I have, and we are kind of over time already, so maybe like 1 or 2 questions, but I'm also happy to talk later. Maybe 1 question, otherwise Tessa is doesn't have so much time. If not, I'm totally fine like skipping the questions, and I'll hand over to Tessa. Thank you very much, Paolo.
Yeah, I'm going to try and be ambitious and maybe do it slightly shorter, but we'll see. It may not work out in the end. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about is whether public school teachers are overpaid in low-income countries, and particularly the evidence here comes from Kenya. And since it is a short presentation, I'll give you sort of the punchline on one slide, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail. So what we're interested in is kind of a very broadly established, well-established stylized fact that distinguishes low-income countries from high-income countries, which is that in low-income countries, if you work in the public sector, you usually had a much higher wage than in the private sector, whereas in high-income countries, it's the other way around. So that fact is well-established, but the sources of it are not so well-established. So what we try and do in this paper is to estimate a large causal public-private teacher wage gap. So what do I mean by causal? It's really for otherwise identical people who, you know, as if they were randomized into the public or into the private sector, we see that those in the private sector, in the public sector, sorry, and particularly our setting as teachers, earn much higher wages. And this is in the context of Kenyan public teachers in primary schools. And so because it is a large wage gap for otherwise identical applicants, that points to the fact that the reason for this wage gap is sort of institutional wage setting. In other words, it's not something on the side of the worker, but it's something on the side of the firm or the institution here. So in doing this, we must actually address that in our setting, you know, we started off this estimating this as a very standard RD paper, that actually standard RD estimators are either underpowered or biased. So, you know, this paper's been around for a while, but we kind of had to go back to the drawing board and think about our estimator very carefully. So that's also partly what we're doing in the paper. And so what we can do is we can diagnose the bias in standard RD estimators and then actually provide some sort of correction for it. So what I also want to say is that even though we have a very nicely identified setting here, so we call it a large causal public-private teacher wage gap that we estimate here, what we come away with in the end is, and I mean, I should say, we started off thinking that, okay, you know, in a lot of my work previously has been on, well, we observe teachers that are not in the public sector on much lower wages. And of course, much of the early literature has kind of talked about, well, so that means we could actually lower these high public wages that we see. But we actually come away at that's not quite the conclusion that one should draw here. So even though you see this large wage gap, it's not actually the policy relevant wage gap. So those are kind of the 3 things that we do in this paper, which are already too many things. So Lukas maybe will tell me something about that later on. So yeah, so we're going to take kind of a Harris-Tadar view and show that this causal wage gap is not the one that policymakers can actually act on. So taking a step back, so what's the motivation here? Why are we interested in this, in understanding this public-private wage gap? I mean, partly whenever you see something that's kind of systematically different around low income and high-income countries, you wonder, well, is that something that explains the difference in incomes? And so there might, of course, be something about this wage gap that is related to development. So whether that's the case or not, it really depends on what the source of it is. So if it's just the fact that workers in the public sector are better educated than in the private sector, then it's a simple human capital story. And so we shouldn't really worry about it. Or maybe it's the fact that working in the public sector is just much less pleasant, and so it's compensating differentials. Or it's something to do with efficiency wages and so on. Or it's institutional wage setting, where really just the public sector, maybe because it's unionized, sets higher wages for otherwise pretty identical work. And it's that last one that really economists are worried about and sort of think could drive a number of things that are bad for development, because it creates wage unemployment, it creates suppressed by private sector growth, and excessively high wages that reduce competitiveness. So Francis Thiel isn't here, but Simon Quinn is here, and so I think we've heard that story before. So that's what we're after here. And so in order to study this, we use this ranked waitlist natural experiment. So here you see the year from Kenya's 2010 teacher hiring to estimate causal civil service wage premium. So let me tell you about the data setting a little bit more. So in 2010, Kenya decided to hire a huge number of new civil service teachers that were coming into the sector at this point. Lukas has already talked about kind of ranked application lists. So our setting is similar here in the sense that we have for 30 Kenyan districts, this hiring was always done at the district. We have the lists of the ranked applicants, and on that list, actually, there isn't so much information: years since graduation, teacher college grades, secondary school scores, and so on. And then in each district, the schools were allowed to hire a fixed number of new teachers. Let's say 66, that was actually the number of vacancies that they had in each school, in each district. So there are about 150 districts in Kenya. We have about a fifth of them we have the data for. And so quite simply, the people at the district, the education officer would simply go down the list until all vacancies are accepted. And what's really nice about this setting is that the people who were lower down the list and didn't get accepted, so didn't get a job in the public sector, which here means teaching in a government primary school, they actually almost always, not always, but to all intents and purposes, they tend to work also as teachers, either in private schools that are sort of close by, or even in the same government schools, but on kind of short-term informal contracts. So already the setting sort of rules out a lot of the sources of the wage gap that we thought about earlier. Yeah? So these people are essentially doing the same job. Of course, there are also people who are then not in the sector, but that's certainly true for many of the unsuccessful applicants here. So when we started on this work, on the surface, we thought, oh, great, this is a super RD setting. We have these applicants being ranked here. And then at some point, the vacancies are all used up and there's going to be a drop. You're not going to get hired anymore if you're above that cutoff, if your rank is high, if you're number 70 on this list, and there were 66 vacancies. And in addition, same job, same school, different sector, as in private versus public contract, so to speak, for those above and below the cutoff. And really, this paper has gone quite far with that. And then someone pointed out to us, and Chez Martin and Begael have written a paper about this, sort of realizing this in 2020, that actually there is an issue here because it's not this clean RD design that we somehow thought it was, because it's a ranked wait list, and actually when some people who are ranked 1 to 66 do not take up the offer for whatever reason, then your cutoff sort of moves endogenously. So if you actually run an RD on the last, where the cutoff is at the last person hired, that's actually, it's going to bias your results. But I really have to say, for the most part, that wasn't very well understood. So a few solutions have been proposed, but none of them fit very well for our paper. So the first one that is very obvious is like, well, if they had 66 vacancies, why don't you just put the cutoff there and use that as kind of fuzzy design? You can do that. In our case, it's just too fuzzy. There's simply no first stage. So for us, that isn't a solution. What the paper, and that's also what the paper by Chez Martin Begahel pointed out, essentially saying, well, you can do that, but you're going to lose a lot of power here. And the second thing that you can do is you can drop the person at this last offer cutoff. And that works in the setting of Chez Martin Begahel, where people are randomly allocated and where they are on these lists, but it doesn't actually work in our setting. So these are sort of the things we had to grapple with here. And let me look at time. So that's just to kind of say that there are these two pieces to the paper. So, but what are the substantive results? Essentially using a fuzzy RD design, we estimate a 40 to 50% wage premium for civil service teachers. And that's huge. That's a huge effect. And this difference is not explained. We do as much as we can. It's not explained by worker characteristics. That's kind of ruled out by these ranked lists. Job conditions, we also actually asked the teachers a lot about, how motivated are you to work, absence, and so on. We don't find any impacts there, search frictions, and so on. So in the end, we conclude that it's still institutional wage setting in the public sector that generates this large wage premium. And so let me show you kind of first the raw results before we think about these biases that arise here. So here simply we just say, last person that was offered the job. So if there were 66 vacancies, maybe they went down to kind of the 70th person. We put the cutoff there. And you see these really large effects. The first two columns here are actually simply the very naive OLS, where we simply regress wages on whether you have a public sector job. And then we also control for your rank on the list. And that interacted with having a public sector job. So that's a purely kind of naive OLS. And you see, so this is kind of Kenyan shillings. So roughly speaking, that's 5,000 shillings. So a $50 increase over and above being not employed as a public sector teacher. So the constant here is roughly 9,000 shillings. So divided by 100. It's not exactly the exchange rate, but it sort of works here to think about it. Then in column 3 and 4, we do the ITT. So now we're sort of doing something more exogenous, where we're just using your position, whether you were above the cutoff or below. So there it's much lower, and that's of course because not everybody above the cutoff was hired. And in fact, it's also fuzzy in the sense that some people below this last cutoff, also sometimes people very low down the list, we don't know why they also end up getting jobs there. So it wasn't like strictly implemented. And then the last column here is the IV, where we're using being ranked above this cutoff or not as the instrument for whether you got a public sector job. And here you can see really this very sizable effect. So roughly 5,000 shilling relative to the 8,000 shillings. So 13,000 shillings, compared to $130 compared to 80. Doing effectively the same job, but being one employed by the government versus not. And then panel B is just the same thing in logs, and so therefore in percentages. So about 60% increase. So we're starting from a very large effect, but then we are taking it seriously that there is a potential bias here going to this last person that was offered the wage. And let me just kind of put in a nutshell what the issue is here. So in a standard RD, you assume that the cutoff is fixed and that the probability of being a compliance, in other words, of taking the job, if you were offered, is continuous at the cutoff. But in a ranked waitlist, what happens is that some offered applicants will decline the position. And so hiring is going to continue until 66 people have accepted. And so therefore, but you might go to the 70th applicant, and that depends therefore on how people above you in the list, whether they accept the job when offered or not. And so the very mechanical consequence of that is that the person who's like right at that last offer, they're always going to be a complier, whereas the next person is going to be, you don't know, right? Some probability that they're a complier, or some probability that they're not going to take the job if they're offered. And so that violates this RD continuity assumption. So what we do then in the paper is, so these are the solutions we could do. We could still use this initial offer cutoff. For us, that just doesn't work. And in many settings, that's going to be underpowered. And the second, what we do then here is that we diagnose and, correct the bias. We haven't actually fully managed to correct it. We've managed to diagnose it, but correcting is difficult. So right now, the way we do it is just to simulate, like, how bad could it be? And so let me kind of skip over this and just say, so we find when we look at kind of your standard RD estimate, which essentially estimates, what is the impact of your rank on wages when you're above the cutoff versus what is the impact of your rank on this list on wages when you're below the cutoff, and then compares the intercept at the rank. So what we find is that the difference in these intercepts, so this is basically, let me keep it here. So what we find is that there are these three sources of bias. So one is this cutoff complier problem. We already said that. So the marginal applicant who gets a job is deterministically a complier, and the next person you just don't know. Essentially, you're looking at the difference of these two people. There's also other things that are going on here that I don't have time to say much about. But other things, there's not just this jump. There's not just the fact that there is a complier with probability 1, but actually the probability of being complier is now also discontinuous. Even if you drop the last person, it also becomes nonlinear. So lots of sources of bias here. And so, here's just the expression. I'm obviously not going to talk through that. So what we do now for the moment is that essentially what we do is that we simulate a data generating process that's kind of close to what happens in our data and our institutional knowledge, where we assume that there is a large causal wage gap, but that is also assumed to differ between compliers and never takers, right? So we assume never takers essentially, they don't have such a bad wage when they reject the job, whereas compliers would have a much lower wage. And then also what we also see in our data is that the effect of rank on taking the job or not is quite small. 5 minutes? Okay, awesome. And so doing that, we can sort of, obviously I don't know the true answer, but what I take here are sort of quite extreme assumptions. And so I find that using this last offer cutoff leads to about a bias of 25% in these effects that we had before. So what that implies in the context of our data, that even if I think, 25% of this like massive effect that we had, which was a 56% wage increase or $55, we're still at roughly 4,000 Kenyan shillings. So yes, there is a bias from treating the data as we do, but the causal wage gap is very likely still large. Okay, so let me just spend the last 2-3 minutes on policy implications of these findings. So when we started off, and in a lot of our other work, mine and Justin's work, we did think of kind of this wage gap, these $50 as, oh, great. So you can actually employ all the teachers who are on the government contracts, you can employ them at $80 a month rather than $130. And wouldn't that be fantastic? Because, you're saving a lot of money for the public purse. And then we sort of kept thinking about that. And of course, to some extent, that's true. Once you've decided that you're a teacher, you've done your teacher training, that's correct. But there's also another way of thinking about that. In the short run, yes, but in the longer run, you're, of course, taking a step back and you're thinking about into which sector you can go. And so then we started going back to kind of the Harris-Todaro view of the world and thought about, okay, what about really? There are 3 sectors here, right? So this, again, you don't need to go through this diagram in detail, but you've all seen a Harris-Todaro diagram. So this is just the Harris-Todaro diagram where on the left here, we basically have our 2 sectors, the WWS there, that's the wage setting wage, that's the wage that the teachers, the public sector teachers get. And then we find this very low wage here, right? The informal wage. That is what the teachers on the short-term contracts get. And we think of it really well, before you make your occupational choice, you think about, well, either I go into this sort of private competitive sector, right? Or I enter the public sector where actually I'm entering this queue or this lottery where either I get the good job, which is the one I want, or I get this informal job or this informal sector contract or private school contract where I have to wait. So really what the outside option is a wage that's much more in between these 2 wages, between these $130 and these $80 that we observe here. And so that's perhaps the wage that we could lower public sector wages to, but probably not, the 60% or the 40% that we estimate here. And so this is just to say, before that was our Harris to Darrow and me just kind of seeing how it would work out. This is the actual data here from Kenya, precisely showing, so what you've got here at the top, Tier C teachers, those are the publicly employed teachers, they earn more than everybody else. What you've got there at the bottom in purple is the other teachers that are on short-term contracts here in public schools, but that are not essentially permanent and pensionable and so on. And in the middle, precisely, we have the other workers. I think we were controlling, of course, for education level here, so there are some controls in this regression at least. And to sort of say, well, that's precisely this intermediate wage. That is probably the policy relevant if you were thinking about, what you could do in order to reduce public spending. And there's my conclusion. So we find a large positive civil service wage premium. It doesn't seem to be driven by worker quality or job conditions. There is this complication, namely that even though it sounds like an RD setting, there's actually some endogeneity going on here that we try to diagnose and also get a sense of how large it is. We simulate its size, but the substantive conclusion appears robust. These institutional wages drive the public sector premium, a large public sector premium. But, even though this is a tightly identified wage gap, it's not necessarily the relevant one for policy.
I have to say, I really enjoyed reading the paper. And I'm not summarizing the paper, but this is kind of what I saw as the main contributions, as from the draft that I read. And one is kind of, I read this a bit as kind of an applied econometrics paper almost, where you develop this methodology, and I really thought it was very cool. I learned a lot from reading it. I don't have a lot of specific comments on that because you know much more about this by now than I do, I'm sure. So I thought it was a very cool application. And then kind of an application to studying the causal effect of public sector jobs, like this causal wage gap. So I struggled a bit with the language of causality here. It's like, of course, I understand where you're coming from, but essentially, like the causal wage gap here, like rephrased as just public sector jobs pay above market wages, I think. And like, so in the econometric context, speaking of causality makes a lot of sense. But just in the terms of a labor context, so I find it quite hard to actually think of kind of what is like the estimate here, like what does it actually mean, just in terms of language. And then kind of you do a lot of work doing kind of suggesting, ruling out alternative mechanisms rather than like pointing towards institutional wage sitting as the mechanism, which is not very surprising at first sight. Like I get your, I think I get what you're trying to do, but I think there's, like you cite the right paper, like from Indonesia, the double or nothing paper, kind of increasing teacher pay doesn't really do anything to like teacher effort or so. We know that like public sector teachers don't really provide more effort than these contact teachers, right? From the RCT evidence as well. The last one on like compensation differential or so for amenities, I think that's maybe not quite as clear cut, but generally speaking, you would also not expect that to be very large. So I think it's not very surprising that like all of your evidence points to institutional wage setting as a mechanism, but then like not knowing Kenya so well, like in the current draft, you mentioned union bargaining power as kind of the main thing. And like, if you tell me that is kind of the thing that's driving it, I believe it. But in the paper, you don't. Like in the paper, you mention it very briefly as kind of a possible mechanism. And kind of, I understand that kind of, you're doing this very cleanly identified causal paper and all pointing to a mechanism that is like very political economy in a way, right? So the mechanism really doesn't yield itself to like a clean causal analysis anymore. But like reading it, I really asked myself, well, like why does this wage gap exist then? And like I just like like one of unions of it, the obvious one, like if there's some past dependence, so like how has this wage gap actually developed over time? Is it like, does it correlate with unionization? I found, like, I asked Gemini to give me some information. It mentioned like the 1997 deal just before an election where teachers like got a big increase, something like this. So like I think just I would have like wanted to see more about this, but your paper is already very long. I fully understand this. So maybe it's like a bit too much. But just given that the institutional like wage setting is such a focus as the mechanism, I felt like there's a bit of a gap there than like not going any further. And I quite liked like linking this to the Harris to Dow framework. This is like very intuitive. I've kind of again, these are ideas for extensions. And so I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should put all of this in the same paper, but like the Harris to Dow model, here, right, it's kind of static, and it's static in a sense that like, people make one choice, but it's a long run kind of static thing. But there's no transition dynamics essentially. And you mentioned these kind of waiting for formal jobs as being very important. And I think that's really a first order concern in many low income contexts. And this wage gap is really directly linked to these kind of waiting times in this game that these teachers have to play in order to eventually get into the formal sector, right? So I was wondering if you can actually link this wage gap a bit more to this kind of waiting behavior, which I think is really a first order concern. Here, maybe if they don't wait unemployed but employed, it's maybe not quite as bad, because like they're not like the young jobless, like young urban unemployed population, but still. I thought that was interesting. I was also interested in kind of heterogeneity by like, how would you think, like if you change this, like would there be a differential selection in the teaching profession potentially? Like who would actually take up these jobs? It's not like, maybe it's more inclusive than if you take out this long waiting time. And another thing, because I work a lot with beliefs and labor market beliefs, and I can just imagine that a lot of these teachers like may be very overconfident about getting jobs. So like the Harris to Dar model kind of assumes that people are very aware of the probabilities and making rational choices. But if people actually overestimate the chance of getting one of these jobs, they may like overinvest in like the teacher human capital, and like they may wait way too long, and then in that case actually reducing kind of the premium even lower may be optimal to kind of correct like for these over optimistic biases. So overall, like these are potential additions, and I can see it maybe being a bit too much, but maybe there's like one more kind of policy focused paper and one more applied econometrics paper in there. I'm happy to discuss it a bit more, but that's what I have.
Thank you so much, Lukas, for these really generous comments. I'm on the one hand very happy that you're calling an applied econometrics paper, but that's also a little bit the tension right now, of course, because I am a development economist, and then I ended up with this applied econometrics paper, and I do think they will have to part ways at some point soon, which would actually then also give space for some of these comments that you made. So totally take the point about causal. Actually, I myself stumble over it every time. I have to remind myself, what do we mean by that? So if you also do, then that's decided. We just have to change that. Let me just go back here on. Yes, I think everything you say is true. My sense is that this is about a very strong union. I mean, partly, I think a little bit what we sort of, the way we thought about it is that we, essentially, there are all these different sources that it could be, and the way we proceed in the paper is that we just try and, reject all the other possibilities, and then sort of like what remains, what we can't reject, has to be the answer. And then we don't go so much into like what is driving that, but I agree that one could do more there, and my sense, but of course it becomes more a qualitative sort of description. I like this here, and it's also something that I struggle with because, of course, on the one hand, we had this big debate, which I think to some extent is over, about, there's such low effort in teaching and how can we incentivize teachers and so on to do all that. On the other hand, we have this debate of how can we create good jobs, right, that pay a decent wage and so on. And these are clearly good jobs, and so there is a tension here. Of course, what it does do, though, is draw people into the sector that then do not have good jobs. So that's maybe the flip side of it. Totally take your point about the Harris to Daro. It's like the lottery is sort of a metaphor for actually something that's more dynamic, which is you go into the sector and you wait and you wait. So, and that's, of course, hugely costly. Although here, I mean, in some sense, the people who are waiting are like subsidizing the sector, right, by providing. So I think there's an interesting welfare analysis to be done there that is more detailed than what we've done. Yes, I think that's hugely true that people overestimate. I mean, here it's more like it's not even that they're overestimating, I don't think, because the way it works, it's like really the thing that most decides whether you got the job is like how long you've queued. So actually, being in the queue for 10 years, then you're gonna get the job. So, but I don't actually have information on that. So here, I think people do know that it's like it's their turn now, in some sense. But then also everybody on the list had sort of like waited around the same time. So maybe it's still true. It's still true. So I mean, these are my kind of comments, and thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is very good points.
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's obviously a very interesting paper. So one thing that struck me is the issue about this wage premium and the fact that public sector teachers are getting a lot more. And the question I have is, so first, I think you're referring to teachers of basic schools.
Yes, primary school. Yes.
Yeah. So in most, at least from where from where I come from, there are two different tracks or two different types of teachers in those kind of institutions, and they go to two different, institutional types, whether public or private. And you will find that public school teachers often go through teacher training programs, and they get placement through the centralized government system.
Yeah.
Right? And then the guys who you find in private school, I usually say someone who goes to university or something like that and is not able to find job somewhere, and then he decides, okay, look, let me find anything that comes my way. So they've got two different type of training. And I think my question is, in your analysis, do you account for the differential training?
Yeah.
And that could be the reason or one of the things that explains the differences in terms of the.
And is this setting in Kenya that you're describing, or is this somewhere else?
No, this is in Ghana. Yes.
Okay, I see.
So I'm from Ghana. So
I'm
using the Ghanaian.
Yeah. So in Kenya, the setting, I mean, in our data, the setting is everyone's been through teacher training, and they have now applied for this government job, and then they just didn't get the job. So really, they are. I mean, when I saw your list there, Lukas, which was essentially is no information, right? Because it's just the same on everybody, and these lists are a little bit like that as well. I mean, they're like teacher training, yes. When did you graduate? Within a year or two of each other. What's your grade? Well, it's either a B or a C. So they are really very, very similar, these applicants. My sense is that in Kenya, that is the case, and partly actually coming back to this historic deal. So what happened is that they did give the teachers a really large pay rise, and then they couldn't afford to hire teachers on these contracts, and yet there are all these trained teachers who are kind of, in waiting. And so in Kenya, it's very much a life cycle thing. I have to say, I know the sector much less well now than I did 10 years ago. So this is to some extent talking about exactly how it was when this happened. It's a life cycle thing. So if you don't get the public sector job right away, you are well trained and everything, but you just kind of wait. And then at some point nobody sticks on these like short-term informal or private sector jobs, private school jobs. I mean, unless you're in the super nice private school in Nairobi, but that's a kind of a different setting. But we should stop. But thank you.
Right, thank you.